Hi there everybody, welcome to Organisational Behaviour Buzzy 1029. In this video we're going to talk about organisational cultures. So by the end of the session you should hopefully be able to define what we mean by an organisational culture, describe the processes of socialisation into organisation cultures, and identify some of the links between organisational structures, as we've talked about previously, and organisational cultures. And we're going to focus in particular on bureaucracy and understanding how organisations develop more bureaucratic ways of working based not only on their structures but also their cultures. So the text to support this class is the Huksinski and Buchanan textbook, chapter 19 in the 6th edition and chapter 4 in the 9th edition. For some reason, by the 9th edition, Huksinski and Buchanan have decided that culture is part of the organisation's environment. I'm not so sure it is, but we'll talk a little bit about that as this lecture goes on. So let's get started. What do we mean by culture? Well, culture is one of those words that we all probably kind of think we understand. Probably we all use it not all the time, but we use it sometimes. But we don't really stop to think about what it means. In studies of organisational behaviour, we have quite a specific understanding of cultures. And that is to say, cultures are the shared values and beliefs and norms which influence the ways that people in organisations feel and act towards each other inside the organisation and the outside of the organisation. A culture is the way that an organisation sort of feels when you go into it. And there was a great deal of attention paid towards organisational culture following sort of the 1970s and 80s, when a number of researchers recognised the limitations of changing organisational structures. And a number of writers started to suggest that rather than change structures or redesign organisations, whether that included flattening their hierarchy or lengthening their hierarchies or centralising power or reducing spans of control or whatever, that actually those structural elements had less impact on the ways people behaved in organisations than was to be expected. And there was a particular movement to compare North American and European organisations with Japanese organisations, which at the time were seen as being incredibly innovative and incredibly productive, even though they had often quite similar organisational designs. And the suggestion made in a number of texts was it was because it wasn't about the organisational design or the structure, it was about the culture. It was about the ways that people did things. It was about the values and beliefs that people shared. It was about the norms that governed people's behaviour. And so this led and has led to a real focus on understanding organisational culture. And it's often said that in organisations, culture is the most important thing. So it's been said that organisational culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch and dinner. In other words, it doesn't matter what you think you're doing, it doesn't matter how you choose to design your organisation. If you don't have the right culture, if you don't have the right shared values, beliefs and norms governing people's behaviour, the strategy won't work. So, organisation theorists have then started to try to understand what kinds of shared values, beliefs and norms exist in organisations and how do they develop and how do they work. A key theorist here is Edgar Schein, who we've actually spoken about earlier on in the course. Schein offers a three-factor analysis of culture. He calls them layers of culture or levels. Schein says organisational cultures are represented by surface manifestations. So these will be like the stories that you hear when you go into an organisation. It might be the physical layout of an office or a factory. Is it open, clean, egalitarian? Is it closed? Is it hostile? Is it messy? Schein says these surface manifestations symbolize or represent something about the culture of an organization? What kinds of jokes do people tell? What kind of language do they use? Do they use lots of aggressive swear words or talk politely to each other? Again, Shine says these surface manifestations represent the culture. They are symbolic. And they represent the values that are shared in the organisation. So what are the things that are valued by members of the organisation? Do they value honesty and integrity? If so, perhaps people will speak very freely. They won't be overly polite. They might be very specific in the way they use language rather than being generic. This is actually a theme that we'll see discussed later on in the course by Vike and Sutcliffe. Do they value excellence above all else? Again, in which case they might work, the surface manifestations might focus on, rewarding excellence and punishing failure. You might see things like lots of awards being given out to reward excellence. Do they value teamwork? Well, in that case, instead of giving the awards to individuals, they might give them to teams, or not even have awards for fear that creates too much competition. So there's a variety of different values that an organisation can share, and Shine's argument is we can see those values in the surface manifestations. And underpinning those values, Shine says, if you want to understand where the values come from, it comes from a set of basic assumptions that are shared by the group. You'll probably remember we use the term basic assumptions when talking about the work of Wilfred Bion in group formation and group functioning. Shine has a slightly different assumption, or a different interpretation, I should say, of basic assumptions. For him, the basic assumption is the taken for granted understanding that that's the way we do it round here sort of idea. Often, these are built into the organisation's structure, but not always. So an example would be, are individual employees or people lower down the chain of command, people on the front line, are they able to act with discretion and autonomy, or do they have to reference things up? Do they have to ask their boss for approval? Now, in many organisations, it's not the case that somebody is telling people on the line what they have to do, but they just kind of know, right? There's a basic assumption or a norm or an expectation. And so people will fall into that. And this is what Shine's talking about when he talks about basic assumptions. They're taken for granted ways of doing things, often unspoken, often not written down, often invisible. I think Shine at one point calls them sort of pre or unconscious understandings of how to act in the organisation. They then influence the kinds of values, the things that people in the organisation value, and they are represented in surface manifestations of the culture. So hopefully this has given us quite an in-depth understanding of organisational cultures, thinking about the different layers of a culture. Various writers have then tried to understand, well, where do these layers come from? For example, Robbins and colleagues talk about cultural values. How is it that particular values get set? How is it that they emerge from these basic assumptions? And they suggest that it's things like the philosophy of the founders of the organisation, or what we've called the organisation's goal. It will be the kinds of criteria that are used when selecting people to join the organisation to ensure that they fit in with the basic assumptions of the organisation. It'll be the activities of top management. And it's here that the socio-technical school would say top managers and effective leaders understand those basic assumptions and work with them. Criticism of the organisational design, and particularly the strategic management approach to organisational design, is that it often acts without understanding those basic assumptions, and then often fails because the organisational design that's imposed doesn't meet the values and the basic assumptions of an organisational culture. And remember, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So, okay, so we've got some people have tried to understand, well then, where do these different elements of organisational cultures come from? How do particular surface manifestations symbolise certain values? We've also got people use this understanding to try to understand different types of cultures. So we have examples of different ways of describing cultures and recognizing differences between organizational cultures. So some have contrasted strong and weak cultures. A strong culture is one where those values and basic assumptions are intensely held by people in the group and really guide their behavior. So if you go in and you don't fit in with those values, you really don't feel part of the organization. A weak culture is one where there's far less agreement about what those values and basic assumptions are, and they give people much more freedom. So, a strong culture tends to be a mono culture, tends to look the same, whereas a weak culture tends to be more of a, what would you call it? A melting pot, I think is the right word. Handy, in a pretty famous typology, said, well, rather than just talking about cultures in terms of the strength that they have, the power, perhaps there's different types of culture, different experiences of culture, different clusters of values and beliefs that create different types of cultures. And he said that you can kind of identify 4, which are caused primarily by basic assumptions around the formalization of work. So how much do people have to rely on rules? And the centralization of authority. So how much autonomy do people feel like they have? So let's just talk through a couple of these. So in a culture which has got low formalization and low centralization, so that means there's not many rules and there's not a lot of authority, like you're free to do what you want. Handy says this can be described as a person culture, where individuals are able to act almost however they want. There can be very star performers who have got a lot of freedom to do what they want. They've got a lot of discretion. There is control over individuals only by mutual consent. So the organisation is seen as being subordinate to the individual. So the individual is important and the organisation is just there to help them. At the other end of the spectrum, you can have what Handy calls role cultures, and these are cultures where the basic assumptions are that there's a lot of rules, and it's very formal rules, and you have to stick by the rules, and authority, power and control is highly centralized in a small group of people who can change the rules. And this produces what Handy calls a role culture. So what does this mean? Well, it means there are very set tasks and roles, divisions of labour in place, with very clear instructions for what people are supposed to do, and people are expected to operate by the book. They have to stick to the script. If you are in sales, you can't do any product development. You can't do any accountancy. There's a lot of, for the British people amongst you, a kind of computer said no culture here. And just intuitively, I think you can understand, if you walked into an organisation, you could quickly identify whether it was kind of a person culture, a role culture. And I won't go over the rest. You can look into them at your leisure. But the key point is, Handy said there are different types of culture, not just different strengths, but different types. There's a similar model offered by Deal and Kennedy, but they emphasise, instead of dividing cultures up in terms of formalisation and centralisation, you can divide cultures up in terms of their assumptions around risk and the level of feedback and reward that people are given. In cultures where there is a slow feedback and reward, you start to get particular types of cultures emerging. Cultures typically where, because you've got a low level of feedback and reward, it's quite hard to hold individual people accountable. So instead, there tends to be a focus on process. Okay? So they talk about process cultures, where it's hard to hold individual people accountable and reward them. If they're successful, people tend to focus on cultures. When there's cultures where, for whatever reason, the tasks allow a great deal of feedback and reward for individuals, you can start to get cultures which are much more focused on individuals than processes. And Deal and Kennedy call these tough guy cultures or macho cultures. And particularly when you add in a culture that's got rapid feedback with one that tolerates high risk, so gives people a lot of autonomy to behave as they see fit, you can start to get these real tough guy cultures, which can, sort of start to verge on what's subsequently called kind of toxic cultures. And we could think about various examples of toxic cultures in the discussions. So, key point, Deal and Kennedy and Handy both provide us a way of thinking about some of the basic assumptions, how they then shape particular kinds of cultural values. But perhaps the most famous and influential contribution here is Burns and Stalker. So Burns and Stalker looked at two different organisations in England, and they suggested that you can understand organisational cultures as working on a spectrum between mechanistic organisations and, which says structures there, it should say cultures. Let's just do this. Cultures. There you go. And oops. So mechanistic cultures are ones that, we would typically call bureaucracies. So they have lots of rules, they have very specialised tasks, very departmentalised structures. There's a high degree of specification as to what an individual should do and how they should do it, and very centralised decision making. These cultures are very appropriate for some tasks, but they can also be very, very controlling and unadaptive. And you can contrast them, as Burns and Stalker do, with what they call organic cultures. And organic cultures are ones where the work hasn't been planned out in advance, but rather it's left to the individual members of the organisation to organically produce and figure out the best ways of working for them. So these cultures will have little specialisation and departmentalisation, they'll have few rules. Individuals will be given a lot of responsibility and authority, which means they'll typically have decentralised decision making or delegated decision making. And the argument has been made that organic cultures are much more adaptive and innovative. They're much quicker to change because individuals can choose what they need to do on the ground rather than having to rely on predefined rules, predefined ways of thinking, and predefined ways of working. However, organic cultures have also been shown to face issues themselves, particularly once they get to a certain size. Once organisations start to have a lot of people, it becomes necessary to have more and more coordination. And we saw this in our class on organisation design and organisation structure, that there's a trade-off between differentiation or departmentalisation and then the need for integration and coordination. Okay, so where are we? Well, we've had a bit of a deep dive into organisational culture and thinking about different types of organisational cultures. So now let's talk a little bit about what we call socialization, which is the way in which an individual learns an organisation's culture. So it's been suggested that there are various ways in which organisations socialise or teach its members their organisations. Obviously, we've got these basic assumptions that we've talked about, and we've got these values that exist. But somebody has to learn to value the values in an organisational culture. So how does that happen? Well, there's a variety of different elements. So obviously you've got like the history of the organisation, the stories that it tells about itself that can shape and direct people about the basic assumptions and values of the organisation. People learn languages, so there's particular technical jargon, particular ways of speaking, particular buzzwords that people use in an organisation, and these often represent a surface manifestation, something about the value. So if you learn to speak in a certain way, you start to shape and show you're part of the culture, but you also start to, if you think back to our class on decision making, start to frame what's going on in particular ways. We've got politics, right? And we know from our classes on culture, or not culture, on conflict, our classes on power, our classes on group formation, that when people enter into organisations, they start to get involved in various political games or power games, which are really battles over the culture of the organisation. And they start to get socialised into informal relationships and informal groups. Then you've got people, right? Only certain kinds of people get recruited to organisations and are able to successfully relate to other people in those organisations. You've got to get along with the people that you work with. And this often means people have to change their behaviours and their attitudes slightly or be socialised. And then, of course, you've got like just doing the work itself. In order to do the work, you're typically going to have to work with other people and you're going to have to work the way they want you to work. And this is, again, a process of socialisation. So Pascal said that you can think of socialisation as almost like a step-by-step process. Right? So firstly, an organisation makes sure it carefully selects the right kinds of people. And as we've seen, many organisations use like psychological theories like personality tests and psychometrics to ensure the right kinds of people. But then there's often this like hazing experience of learning about the new recruit, finding out about them, getting them to tell people through induction processes and induction activities about themselves. So often people will go out for drinks together, or there'll be a celebration event, or even just induction activities, or a survey, for example. Recently I did an ethnography in an organisation, and I had to tell everyone over the email what my favourite film was and my favourite music and what I would be doing if I wasn't working at the company. This was a way of the company learning about me. Then you start to get like training, you start to learn the language and how to do things, and you start to be told, no, don't do that, it doesn't work like that around here. So you start to learn the basic assumptions. And then as you start doing things, you start to get rewarded for particular ways of behaving and told off or controlled for others. And so through this process, you start to learn the basic assumptions, the values of the organisations. These get reinforced over time, and you'll start to find that there are role models, people that you're looking up to, people that you're trying to change your behaviour to be like, because they seem to be being successful in the organisation. And this process creates this socialisation. One of the other things which has been noted in organisation behaviour is organisations don't just create cultures out of nothing. And people don't come to organisations as like an open book or a blank page. Rather, organisations tend to be shaped by their national cultures. So an American organisation will be different from a Japanese organisation culturally. Why is that? A man called Gert Hofstadter, in a very famous study, surveyed over 100,000 employees of a multinational company across about 40 countries. And he said, you would expect these people are all in the same organisation, they should have the same culture. But they didn't. They had the same structure, they were in the same organisation, but they didn't have the same cultures. And his explanation for it was, what he found was that the nation where the companies were located, where the workers were, and where they came from, had a big influence on the kinds of cultures that they experienced. And so Hofstadter said, you've got national cultures, right? So being British or Chinese or Indian creates a cultural background which you bring with you into the organisation. And when you go into a British organisation or an American organisation, it has its own national culture. So it was almost like psychometrics, but at the level of nations. So Hofstadter said you can think about national cultures and how they play out in organisational cultures through 5 dimensions. There's the social orientation. So are they individualistic or collective? Do they focus on individuals? Do they value individuals, individual accountability, responsibility, freedom, or the collective? What's their power orientation? Do they respect power? Or do they see that they kind of tolerate power, but actually they value independence? How much do they accept uncertainty? So are they willing to be very creative and innovative and see what happens, or do they like things to be very ordered? Other ways you can distinguish nations is what's called their goal orientation. So are people very aggressive in trying to reach their goals? Really, really focused on achieving their KPIs, driving everything to achieve the goals? Or do they just see the goals as feedback for what they're doing? And if they achieve their KPIs, that's a good thing, but they're going to try to do the activities the way they want to do them and then they'll see what happens. And finally, you can distinguish national cultures in terms of time orientation. Some national cultures are very focused on the long term, long-term investments, often those which are willing to accept uncertainty, will be willing to have long-term outlooks. But you can contrast those with national cultures and organisations which have a short-term outlook. So, Hofstede's point is, people are already socialised into cultures by their nation. And then they go into organisational cultures which are shaped around those national cultures. And this can help people through the process of socialisation. So if you go to work in an international organisation, you might find it's got a very different national culture, but then you find somebody from your home country and you share the same basic assumptions and values, and you can figure out how to work in the organisation together. Okay, so we've defined organisation culture. We've talked a little bit about the process of socialisation. Let's have a little bit of a talk through the links between structure and culture. So I'm going to do this by thinking about bureaucracy. As you'll hopefully remember from our recording on bureaucracy, Huxinski and Buchanan talk about bureaucracy as a type of structure. I would argue it's a type of culture because it's a way of doing something. It's a set of values about how to organise. Bureaucracy was famously analysed by Max Weber, and he thought about it as very much a cultural form of organisations. So Weber said, bureaucracies developed as an efficient form of organisation in particular types of cultures, particularly those with what he called a Protestant work ethic, which we won't go into on this course, but the key point is, for Weber, bureaucracy was very much a way of organising, what Burns and Stalker would call a mechanistic way of organising, but one which matched a particular national culture, and one which has its own culture within the organisation. So it's a culture where there are very stable rules and policies, very fixed, defined areas of control, where authority is only legitimate because of the role, not the person. So we've talked about this in terms of legitimate sources of power before. In bureaucracies, if I have the role of a manager, I have authority to tell my subordinates what to do, not because of my knowledge, my expertise, my charisma, my experience, my personal background, but because I have the role of the manager. In bureaucracies, there's hierarchies, very clear lines of communication, supervision. There's very little discretion or judgment for individuals. So bureaucracies share all these values, right? They value efficiency. They value the formal structures and rules above everything else. And for Weber, this made them particularly effective styles of organisations, in particular cultures. Because you start to get, instead of relying on somebody's family background or their race or their gender or their age, you start to get into a situation where if somebody has risen to a role based on their merit and their abilities, then because they have the role, it doesn't matter who they are or where they come from, they can direct decisions. They can instruct people what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, because they have legitimate authority of the bureaucracy. So Weber thought this was a really good way of organising, but more commonly now, people tend to think about bureaucracy, and Weber himself, actually, to be fair, did consider it as an iron cage, as bureaucracies having a significant problem, which is they can be kind of boring because they're very rules-based. And one way to think about this is through the distinction between means and ends. In bureaucracies, it's been argued that the means, the how we do something, is more important than the what we do. Later critics of bureaucracy say what this does is it produces a situation where bureaucracies can be used to do incredibly horrible things. These cultural forms of bureaucracies can be used to do incredibly horrible things. Zygmunt Bauman, in analysing the Holocaust around the Second World War by the Nazis in Germany, said, how is it that they used all these bureaucratic rules? They were very organised system to, commit genocide, to kill millions of people. And Bauman said it was because of bureaucracy. Because bureaucracy, he said, values means as ends in themselves. So as long as we've organised this thing efficiently, it doesn't matter what we're doing. So he said that what happens is bureaucracies can become mad. They can be very rational, they can seem very efficient, but that they can become mad places. And there's all manner of stories about this throughout organisation studies. So this is the Vanci Protocol, which if you've not looked it up, you might want to have a look at it. There's various movies about this, actually. And this was a protocol, or a way of calculating whether people should be part of the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust in World War II. So it was essentially a group of bureaucrats sat around and decided, well, how can you tell whether somebody is Jewish enough to be killed in the Holocaust, or if they are a communist enough to be killed in the Holocaust? Where's the cutoff, And they tried to figure out very set rules to calculate it. Those fans of American history, there's good examples in the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, it was to start off with a very bureaucratized war, where they tried to measure the success in terms of the kill count. So, what was the logic? The logic was, in order to win the war, we have to kill more people than get killed. So, at the end of every day, American soldiers would go around and count how many people were killed. And if more people were being killed on the Vietnam side, the Americans thought they were winning. But of course, this produced a crazy situation, firstly, where people were just killing anybody, so there was lots of civilians that would get killed because it increased their kill count. And then they'd start to just make up the numbers, because they would be told, we have to kill this many people today, and if you haven't done it, just make it up. So you start to get bureaucracies, when they value means above ends, becoming very, very toxic cultures, becoming cultures which do not do what they're trying to achieve. So there's lots of strange things going on with bureaucracies, but what I want to talk about now is the question of, when do organisations choose to bureaucratize? So what's the relationship between the structure and the culture? I'm going to use the work of Alvin Goldner. Goldner went into a gypsum mine and analysed when managers chose to rely on bureaucratic rules, when they chose to rely on the authority structure, when they chose to tell people what to do. And his argument was, the move to bureaucratize, to create a bureaucratic culture, was caused as much by personal factors as by structural ones. What does that mean? Well, it means Goldner found you could have the same organizational structure, so you could have the same locusts of control, the same spans of control, the same departmentalization, the same hierarchy, and people wouldn't be bureaucratizing. People wouldn't want to create a bureaucratic culture. But then when people changed in the organization, suddenly there was a move to change the culture. So the key point here was the culture and the structure were not the same. So a good example would be, in the mine that Goldner was analysing, a new manager came in. And he came in from outside the local area, right? So he didn't fit into the wider culture. And what happened was, because he didn't fit into the wider culture, he didn't speak the right language. He didn't know the jokes. He didn't know people. He hadn't been socialised. He wasn't part of the informal organisation. So when he wanted to get things done, the only way he could make people beneath him get things done was by relying on bureaucratic structures, by saying, I am the manager, you have to do what I tell you to do. So Goldner said, when you start to see people in organisations trying to change the culture, typically it's not because of the structure. That the two things aren't the same. It's because of the people. The people come into an organisational culture. They don't understand, they don't appreciate, they can't change the structure, so they try to change the culture. So, what's the key point? The key point is there's a very complicated relationship between cultures and structures. You can't just say, because an organisation has a strong hierarchy, because it is departmentalised and has specialisation, it's therefore bureaucratic, it's mechanistic. Goldner's work tells you that's not true. You can have the same kinds of structures, but very different cultures. And the same kinds of structures even within one organisation, and a variety of different cultures and cultural experiences going on. So, that takes us back to our third and final point. When we're talking about the links between structure and culture, the key point is that structure and culture aren't the same. And this, of course, takes us back to the culture eats strategy for breakfast idea. Goldner's work, and what I would encourage you to recognise, is that it's very easy for people looking at organisations to focus on the structure and not pay attention to the culture. It's very easy for us to think if we change the structure, we'll change the culture. But Goldner shows us the links between structure and culture are far more complicated than that. Often they work the other way around. The culture is an interpretation of the structure. Okay, I can keep going on about that for a long time, but it's not going to help you, so let's just think about this. We've defined organisational culture, yep. We've talked through some of the processes of socialisation, yes. And now we've talked a little bit about the links between structure and culture. So if you've got any questions or concerns, please go onto the Moodle discussion forums or come to one of the drop-in question and answer sessions. Hopefully that's been interesting and you feel we have met the objectives of the video.